The clock on the wall of my shop said 6:47 in the morning. And I was already covered in rust dust and regret. Not about my life or anything dramatic like that, just regret that I'd agreed to take on a 1920s Seth Thomas mantel clock that some estate sale picker had dropped off the week before, with a box full of loose parts, and a handwritten note that said, "Good luck." The mainspring was seized, 2 of the barrel teeth were chipped, and whoever had tried to fix it last had used the wrong grade of oil on the escapement. It was a mess. But it was my kind of mess. I run a small clock and watch repair shop in Asheville, North Carolina. The sign above the door says Callahan Timepieces, Restoration and Repair. My grandfather started it. My dad kept it going for 30 years. And when he retired down to Hilton Head 6 years ago, the keys landed in my hands. I was 26 and had exactly 2 employees, one of whom was a part-time college kid who mostly just swept up and answered the phone. Now I'm 31, still 2 employees, and the college kid graduated and moved to Portland. But the work is good, and the shop is mine, and most days I wouldn't trade it for anything. Most days. That particular Tuesday in October, I had 14 jobs on the bench, a busted display case waiting on a glass order from a supplier in Georgia, and a to-do list that had stopped being a list and become more of a scroll. I was deep in the Seth Thomas when I heard the front door open. We didn't open until 9. I'd forgotten to lock it behind me. I wiped my hands on my bench rag and leaned around the corner to see who'd come in. A woman was standing in the middle of the shop, looking at the wall of clocks the way people look at a painting. They're not sure they understand. She was maybe 50, maybe a little older, dressed in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers that looked like they cost more than my rent. Her hair was silver blonde, cut clean and precise, and she held a black leather portfolio under one arm like she'd just come from a board meeting. She wasn't the kind of person who usually walked into my shop. "We're not open yet," I said. She turned. "I know, your door was unlocked. My mistake. Are you Nathan Callahan?" I said I was. She didn't smile, exactly. But something in her face settled, like she'd been holding a question for a while, and finally got an answer. "My name is Charlotte Whitmore. I drove up from Charlotte this morning. I need to talk to you about something, and I'd rather do it before the rest of the world wakes up, if that's all right." I looked at her. I looked at the clock on the wall. I looked back at her. "You want coffee?" I said. She said yes. "I have a small back room with a coffee maker, and a mini fridge, and a folding table where I eat lunch." We sat across from each other in 2 mismatched chairs, and I poured us both a cup of gas station level coffee that I'd brewed at 6, and she drank it without complaint. Which told me something. "My family owns Whitmore Estate Group," she said. "We manage private estates, art collections, and historical properties throughout the Southeast. We've been operating since my grandfather's time, almost 80 years. I nodded. I'd heard of them, vaguely. Old money, old properties. The kind of company whose name shows up on donor plaques at museums and botanical gardens. "We're in trouble," she said, and she said it the way someone says it when they've been fighting against saying it for a long time. Flat and clean and a little tired. "My father passed away 14 months ago. He was the one who kept everything together. The relationships, the trust of our clients, the institutional knowledge. When he died, we discovered that not all of his records were in order." She set her coffee down. "There's a collection, a private clock and watch collection that belonged to one of our oldest clients, a man named George Aldrich, who died 2 years before my father. The collection is significant, historically, financially. It's been sitting in a climate-controlled storage facility in our Asheville property for almost 3 years now, and the Aldrich estate is now being settled by his grandson, who is not a patient man." "How significant?" I said. "If properly cataloged and authenticated, somewhere between $4 and $7 million. I did not touch my coffee. The grandson wants the collection assessed within 60 days, Charlotte said. He has a lawyer who has a lawyer, and those two lawyers have sent us a letter that I have read approximately 40 times. The collection hasn't been touched since George died. We don't know what condition it's in. We don't know if pieces are missing. We don't know if some of what's in there is authentic and some isn't. She paused. My father believed it was all genuine. He trusted George completely. But belief and documentation are two different things, and right now we have the belief and not much of the documentation. Why me? I said. She looked at me directly. Because your grandfather worked with George Aldrich for 30 years. He authenticated 3 of the pieces that are now in that collection, personally. His notes are the closest thing to documentation we have. I sat back. My grandfather, Earl Callahan, had died 8 years ago. I'd inherited the shop and a storage room full of his bench records. Handwritten notebooks going back to the 1970s, annotated with his cramped cursive and occasional pencil, sketches of movements and cases. I'd never thrown them away because I couldn't. But I hadn't exactly cataloged them either. You think my grandfather's records can help you, I said. I think they might be the only thing that can. I looked at her. She didn't look away. I'm not an appraiser, I said. I'm a repairman. I fix things. I'm not certified by AAA or NAWCC to do formal appraisals. I know what you are and what you aren't, she said. I did my research before I drove 3 hours this morning. What I need isn't just an appraiser. I need someone who knows these specific kinds of pieces, who understands the provenance markers, who can read your grandfather's notes and translate them into something a court would find credible. I also need someone who can tell me honestly what's in that room. She picked up her coffee again. I need someone I can trust to look at something very old and very valuable and tell me the truth about what they see. I thought about the Seth Thomas sitting on my bench with its busted mainspring and its wrong oil. What's the pay? I said. She named a figure that was almost exactly what I made in 4 months. I drank my coffee. It was bad coffee. It tasted a little bit like everything changing. I'll need to see the collection first, I said, before I agree to anything. She nodded once. Of course. The Whitmore property in Asheville was a converted Victorian estate off Merriman Avenue. The kind of house that had been a private residence in another century and now served as a regional office for the company, with a carriage house out back that had been retrofitted into a proper climate-controlled storage facility. Charlotte met me there that Saturday morning with a key card and a legal pad. The room was long and low-lit, with rows of padded shelving and individual locked cases. I walked slowly. I didn't touch anything yet. I just looked. There were bracket clocks, Vienna regulators, a pair of French carriage clocks that made my chest tighten a little just looking at them. A glass case held pocket watches, at least 30, some in display stands, some in individual boxes. There was a long case clock against the far wall, tall and dark-cased, that I recognized as English, probably late 17th century, if my eye was right. There was a skeleton clock under a glass dome that I had to physically stop myself from reaching for. Your grandfather authenticated that one, Charlotte said, coming up beside me. She pointed to the skeleton clock. In 1987, George Aldrich had just purchased it from a dealer in London. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at her. I need my grandfather's records, I said. We know. That's part of the arrangement. And I'm going to need more than 60 days. She almost smiled. Work fast. What happened over the next 6 weeks is hard to explain to someone who has never loved a thing the way I love old mechanical clocks. It wasn't just a job. It was archaeology. It was reading a language that my grandfather had spent his entire life learning to speak, and finding out that he'd left a kind of letter inside those notebooks for whoever came after him. Even if he didn't know who that would be. The first week, I drove back to my shop every evening and went through boxes. I found 4 notebooks that referenced Aldrich pieces specifically. My grandfather's handwriting was small and dense and occasionally maddening, but I knew it. I'd grown up watching him write in those books, hunched over his bench with a magnifying lamp and a pencil, muttering to himself. Reading them felt like hearing his voice. Charlotte checked in with me by phone at the start of each week. Professional. Direct. She asked specific questions and listened to the answers without interrupting. I found that I looked forward to those calls more than I expected to. The second week, I met the grandson. His name was Preston Aldrich. And yes, I noticed the irony immediately. Given the list of names I'd been mentally avoiding, no wait, let me just call him what he was. A man in his late 30s, who wore a sport coat to a storage facility and checked his phone 3 times during our 15-minute conversation. He wanted a dollar figure. He wanted it in writing. He wanted it before Thanksgiving. "Mr. Callahan will need the time he needs," Charlotte said, and her voice was quiet and completely unbothered by the fact that Preston was 2 inches taller and currently trying to intimidate her. He left. I watched her watch him go. "Does that happen a lot?" I said. "Men like that?" She picked up her legal pad. "Often enough." Third week I found the problem. There was a piece in the collection that didn't match. A pocket watch, gold case, listed in the inventory my father had apparently compiled from memory after George died. Listed as an 1890s Illinois Watch Company piece. 17 jewels, railroad grade. It was in one of the individual boxes, wrapped in tissue, and when I opened it and held it in the light, something was wrong. The case felt right. The dial looked right. But the movement. I took it back to my bench. Spent an evening with it under the lamp. The movement was not Illinois Watch Company. It was a nice movement. Good quality, well preserved. But it was a Swiss cylinder escapement, probably 1910s, and whoever had put it in that case had done it deliberately. The case was genuine. The movement was a replacement. And the replacement had been aged. Artificially, carefully, to look original. Someone had doctored this watch. Not recently. Maybe 30 or 40 years ago, based on the oxidation patterns. But deliberately. I sat with that for 2 days before I called Charlotte. "I need to meet with you," I said.
In person.
She didn't ask why on the phone, which I appreciated. We met at a coffee place on Lexington Avenue on a Wednesday morning. The kind of place with exposed brick and a chalkboard menu and jazz, playing at a volume that was either perfect or annoying depending on your mood. She got there before me and had already ordered, which I also appreciated. I laid out what I'd found. I showed her photographs I'd taken on my phone, zoomed in on the movement, annotated with notes. I walked her through the difference between what the piece was supposed to be and what it actually was. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Does this invalidate the rest of the collection?" she said. "Not necessarily. One altered piece doesn't mean everything is altered. But it means someone at some point introduced a fraudulent element, or made a mistake that they then tried to cover up. Either way, it changes the documentation picture." She looked at her coffee. "This could ruin us. Or it could be what saves you," I said. She looked up. "If you find it and disclose it, you're the ones who caught it. You're the ones who did the work to protect the integrity of the collection. That matters, legally and reputationally. If Preston Aldrich's appraiser finds it, and you didn't, that's a different story." I picked up my own coffee. "You hired someone who did the job right. That's what I'm telling you." She was quiet again for a moment. Then, something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but the thing that lives just behind one. "My father would have said the same thing," she said. "He believed that the only move when you find something you don't want to find is to find it louder than everyone else." He sounds like he knew what he was doing. He was the best person I've ever known. She said it simply, without performance, and then looked back at her coffee. "I'm sorry, you didn't need to hear that." "I didn't mind," I said, and I meant it. We kept working. I kept going through the collection piece by piece, and Charlotte kept showing up. Not to check on me, exactly, but to be present in a way that made the whole thing feel less like a job for someone else and more like something we were doing together. She would bring coffee sometimes. She would sit at the far end of the room with her legal pad and make notes while I worked. We talked about the pieces. She knew more than she let on at first. She'd grown up watching her father work, listening to him talk about provenance and condition, and the specific way a maker's mark should look on a genuine piece versus a reproduction. "You know more about this than you told me," I said one afternoon, about a month in. She glanced up from her notes. "I know enough to ask the right questions. You know enough to answer them." It seemed like a reasonable arrangement. That's a very lawyerly way to describe it. I've spent a lot of time around lawyers. I found myself laughing, which surprised me. She looked surprised too, briefly, and then something in her expression relaxed, in a way I hadn't seen before. The collection, as it turned out, was overwhelmingly genuine. The one altered watch was the only problematic piece. And after I documented it fully, Charlotte brought in a specialist from the NAWCC to verify my findings independently, which was the right call. The specialist confirmed everything. They disclosed it to Preston's team before anyone asked. Charlotte's attorney framed it in the language of due diligence and good faith. And while Preston was not happy, Preston was rarely happy. From what I could tell, the legal position was solid. The formal assessment came in at $5.8 million for the authenticated pieces, with the doctored watch cataloged separately and disclosed fully. It was a number that covered the Aldrich estate's expectations and kept Whitmore's reputation intact. We finished on a Friday afternoon in late November, 2 days before the deadline. Charlotte had a tradition. She told me about it that day, as we were packing up the last of the documentation. Her father had always marked the close of a difficult project by going somewhere quiet and having a good meal and letting himself actually feel that it was over. "It sounds like he was a smart man," I said. "He was." She set the portfolio down and looked at me. "I was thinking of doing the same thing. Tonight, there's a place on the south side of town, old house converted to a restaurant, very good food." A pause. "I'm not good at asking for things. I've never been, but I'm asking if you'd want to join me." I looked at her. She looked at me. Outside, the late November light was going copper through the carriage house windows, and the skeleton clock that my grandfather had, authenticated in 1987, was sitting on the shelf to my right, ticking in that quiet, unhurried way that old clocks tick when they've been wound properly and left to do what they were made to do. "Yeah," I said, "I'd like that." The restaurant was called Ashwood, and it was exactly what she'd described. A converted Victorian, all dark wood and candlelight, and the smell of something good coming from the kitchen. We sat at a corner table, and the service was slow in the way that good restaurants are slow, unhurried, like the evening had nowhere else to be. We talked about the collection. We talked about my grandfather. I told her about watching him work when I was 8 years old, sitting on a stool in the corner of the shop while he explained the difference between an anchor escapement and a deadbeat, his hands moving with the kind of patience I spent years trying to learn. She told me about her father showing her how to look at a painting, not at the subject of it, but at the surface, the brush texture, the places where a painter's hand had hesitated or pressed too hard. He said, "The truth of a thing is usually in the parts people didn't plan," she said. "That's exactly how you look at a clock movement," I said. She smiled. It was a real one this time, unhurried, and it stayed. We closed the restaurant. The staff was very polite about it. We walked out into the cold November air and stood on the sidewalk, and I said it had been the best meal I'd had in longer than I wanted to admit. And she said the same, and for a moment we were both quiet in the comfortable way that you're only quiet with someone when the conversation has already said everything it needs to. I'll be in touch about the final paperwork, she said. I figured. She looked at me. I'll also be in Asheville again in 2 weeks. The company is considering purchasing a property here, and I'll need to be on site for the assessment. That sounds like something that would take a while, I said. It could, she said. These things usually do. I told her I'd be at the shop. She said she knew where to find it. She walked to her car, and I walked to mine, and I sat for a minute before I started the engine, just listening to the quiet. She came back in 2 weeks, like she said. The property assessment took 3 days. On the 3rd day, she came to the shop. Not about work. She came in just before closing. No portfolio. No legal pad. Just Charlotte, in a blue coat I hadn't seen before, coming through the door that I'd remembered to lock, and then unlocked when I saw it was her. She looked around the shop the way she'd looked around it that first morning, except this time she wasn't studying it. She was just looking. You fixed the display case, she said. Glass came in last week. She came up to the counter. She had a question on her face that she was taking a moment to get right. I am not a person who does things without thinking them through, she said. I run projections. I consider outcomes. I don't tend to make moves without knowing where they're going to land. She paused. But there's something I've been thinking about since that dinner, and I can't project my way out of it, which is unusual for me. I waited. I'd like to know if you'd be interested in spending more time together, she said. Not for a project. Not for any professional reason. Just time. The way people do when they want to. I looked at her. I thought about the first morning she'd walked in here in her board meeting blazer and drank bad coffee without flinching. I thought about her sitting in the storage room with her legal pad while I worked, asking the right questions. I thought about what she'd said about her father, that the only move when you find something you don't want to find is to find it louder than everyone else. I thought about how the Seth Thomas mantel clock was still on my bench, finally reassembled, finally running, its chime going off every 15 minutes now, as if making up for the time it had spent in pieces. I'd like that, I said. I'd like that a lot, actually. She exhaled, just slightly, and I realized she'd been holding that breath. We went to get coffee, real coffee this time, from an actual decent place 3 doors down, and we talked until the place closed. It was a Tuesday night in December, and the Christmas lights on Lexington were just starting to come on outside the window, and Charlotte was telling me about a long case clock her father had restored when she was a girl, and she was laughing at a part of the story that she hadn't meant to find funny, and I was watching her laugh, and I thought, this is the thing about time. You can't wind it backward. You can't make it go faster. All you can do is keep the mechanism clean, keep it running, and pay attention to what the hands are doing while they move. I paid attention. For the first time in a long time, I didn't want to be anywhere else.